Morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Electric Africa webinar series, AI, Artists, and Immersive Futures. My name is Ajwa Nkoma, Director of Policy and Research at Electric South, and I will be your host today. This three-part webinar series has been designed to connect Electric South's past work on AI and immersive media with current perspectives in the field, and to set the stage for our upcoming AI and immersive media convening in Johannesburg next week. Today, I'm truly delighted to welcome Brett Gaylor, a pioneering interactive media producer and researcher whose work pushes the boundaries on digital storytelling, media literacy, and immersive technologies. Brett's body of work spans some of the most innovative intersections of film, technology, and critical inquiry. His recent releases include Necessary Tomorrows, a speculative documentary podcast with Al Jazeera, Welcome to the Metaverse, an augmented reality project for the 2023 International Symposium on Electronic Art in Paris, and Discriminator, an interactive film that has had its world premiere at the 2021 Tribeca Film Festival. His 2020 documentary, The Internet of Everything, broadcast in more than 20 countries. For earlier projects such as Do Not Track, OK Google, and RIP, a Remix Manifesto, Brett received the International Documentary Association Award, a Peabody Award, the Prix Jameau, and 3 Webbies. Brett also received the prestigious Canada Veneer Scholarship for Brain Rot Revolution, a creative research initiative to build critical data literacy, a theme that runs through so much of his practice. He has been part of Electric South's journey from the 2023 Responsible AI series and the AI Toolkit and Conversation Starter, and continues to ask the hard questions about how artists can retain agency while experimenting with AI. Our theme for today's episode, the third in our three-part webinar series, is AI and Artists in Practice. We'll reflect on how artist engagement with AI has evolved in recent years, the lessons from Electric South's earlier work, and the opportunities and risks AI presents for creative agency now. We'll spend about 35 to 40 minutes in conversation and in presentation, and then open the floor to questions for the last 20 minutes. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box at any time. So, Brett, let's start with your relationship with Electric South. Can you share some reflections on your previous interactions with us, particularly through the AI Toolkit, and also take us through your work as it is now?
Thank you, Ajwa. I'm just grateful to be here. It's early morning where I am in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And yeah, I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm always just excited to be able to connect with the Electric South community. I've known some of the folks who began the organization decades ago. And my first interaction with this generous and warm community was in 2023, where I was fortunate enough to travel for the New Horizons cohort of makers, where I was, just introduced to the depth of talent in the continent and the very smart engagement that Electric South was sort of making at that early time with the sort of tools of AI that were moving from kind of research labs into things that us as makers and artists would have access to. And so yeah, I think that was my first interaction with the artists that were starting to want to make things with these tools and sort of interrogate what they could take from them, what they might want to offer as critical responses to the way that these tools were being made, and the sort of benefit and also sort of danger that they sort of would place on artist communities, but also just as us as humans in general, what we need to be thinking about when we use these. And I think that the sort of perspective of many of those artists, and I think it's reflected in those materials that you published as that toolkit, sort of reflect this idea of having kind of an ambivalence towards this technology. And so I choose that word not because it refers to sort of a like oh, I don't care about these tools. We think of that word ambivalence as like, oh, I'm kind of ambivalent about AI. It might take over the world or it might not. I prefer to think of it as um, ambivalence, meaning we're quite aware that there are benefits to this technology, and there are, as creators, there's just obviously so many interesting things that we can do with this technologies. There's affordances that these large language models or image generating tools give us that were previously unavailable to us.
Mhm.
For instance, being able to sort of tap into some kind of collective imaginary, to be able to create images in real time that are sort of unique and novel, um, the ability to sort of surface potentially some of the very critical ideas that we might have about them related to their bias or to the sort of what the academic Kate Crawford refers to as this idea of enchanted determinism, where we sort of ascribe to them this magical power without sort of applying the other lens, which is sort of an interrogation of the power dynamics that have built them and that they might continue to perpetuate. So there's this excitement about them on the one hand, but also sort of a awareness on the other, right? We're quite aware that they require massive amounts of capital to create. We're quite aware that they require massive amounts of resources of the earth to create. We're very aware that the conditions on which they're created depend on extractive labor practices, sort of extensions of colonialism that perpetuate to this day. And so that ambivalence for me is sort of being able to try to hold both of those two things at the same time and make work from that place. Um, so that was a bit of a long-winded way of thinking about the that introduction to the Electric South community, because it really sort of like my introduction, I think, was in 2023 and the fall of that year to really, like, I've been aware of Electric South obviously from Ingrid and Stephen's work in this area, but then being able to be a part of the community, as it were, was really then, and that was the same time that a lot of artists were engaging with these technologies for the first time.
That's quite interesting. And how does that factor into, I guess, what you're doing now? I know that you have, um, I think, a presentation to share with us.
Yeah, well, yeah. So why don't I do that? You were generous enough to share some sort of questions, which I've tried to weave into some thoughts that I have now. Um, I can go ahead and share my screen if you all are ready for that. Do this. How's that?
There we go. There we
Okay.
go.
Okay. So just full disclosure, Adjo, I finished this last night and I decided to call this set of ideas Summoning a Brain Rot Revolution, because the sort of last project that I've um, made in a series of three that I created during a PhD dissertation at Simon Fraser University is called Brain Rot Revolution. And it's a multi-format project that I'm realizing across a lot of different types of media, which is sort of, that's my thing, having an idea that we sort of find what is the best media to explore that subject in. But just sort of to orient everybody, I live in the country that is now known as Canada. I'm on the west coast of that, the most southwest portion of this country, as you can be. But obviously, it's known as Canada is a blip in what this place has been known as. Um, this is the traditional territory of the Senchothan speaking people, the Hulkaminian speaking people, and many other languages and peoples. What the province of British Columbia, for those of you who don't know, is a almost 90% unceded territory, unlike the rest of Canada, where treaties were signed in the process of colonization and settling of this territory. British Columbia much of the territory of this province is actually unceded, and there's many different interlocking peoples and claims and languages of this region. So that's just worth knowing that when somebody says that they're from Canada, there's a lot of different layers to what that means, as of course many territories of the world are like that. Um, this is a postcard that I actually it might be right here. Yes, it is. This is a postcard from a film festival, CPH Docs, that I attended in 2008, and it's always kind of stuck with me. The quote was, "If I can't dance, it's not my revolution," which is actually a misquote from an anarchist named Emma Goldman. The correct quote, this is like often a bumper sticker that you see around, but the full quote is, at the dances, I was one of the most untiring and gayest. I did not believe that a cause which stood for a beautiful idea, for release and freedom from convention and prejudice, should demand the denial of life and joy. So she was dancing at this party, and all the other anarchists were like, "Hey, you're being too happy," um, and Emma, of course, thought that was nonsense. That any revolution that she wanted to be part of should be a happy revolution, and I think about that a lot in the context of making work about the digital society, which I've been up to for a while. Um, my first feature documentary, RIP, Remix Manifesto, from 2009. This sort of came out when user generated content and remix culture were the sort of dominant mode of the internet. It was around the sort of Web 2.0 period, and there was a lot of joy at the potential affordances of the internet. But over time, we saw that much of that kind of enthusiasm for the internet moved into sort of a dread of what we were seeing in the way that the sort of commons was enclosed by companies, and these sort of the open web sort of transformed into sort of a platform surveillance capitalism that we're so familiar with today. Um, and when I made RIP, I was attempting to do uh, this thing that Umberto Eco called semiotic guerrilla warfare. And he's got a fun quote too, is that the battle for the survival of man as a responsible being in the communications era is not to be one where the communication originates, but where it arrives. Mm. And so what he's referring to is this sort of idea of culture jamming. So the practice of attempting to subvert a media, but potentially showing the sort of true power dynamics of this media by um, using the media against itself in a way. So oftentimes we would think of this in terms of the way people would sort of put a piece of graffiti on a billboard. You know, Coca-Cola is trying to send an advertisement that's associating them with love, and just by adding profit at the bottom, this culture jammer is being able to sort of point out the ways that Coca-Cola is a capitalist enterprise. So the communication channel stays the same, but by changing the final sort of bit at the end, the smart culture jammer is able to kind of point out these different power dynamics using the same media that the original sender of the message was using. And I didn't know it at the time, but this is also sort of the primary way that many researchers practice this methodology of research creation. And the two Canadian academics, Sawchuk and Chapman, have this sort of great way of describing this practice that artists and researchers can undertake, which is bringing forth the very phenomena we seek to explore. Mm. So in the case of RIP, what we did in this film, it was about remix culture. It was the artist you see there, Girl Talk, he would make music by reassembling bits of other people's music that he found on the internet. And for us, that was a metaphor for the way that this boundary between what we used to call the fan or used to call the audience was blurring between what we used to call the producer, and that many more people were able to participate in their culture because of these affordances of digital culture and broadcast or social media. So we wanted to kind of incorporate that into the film. And so in the film, we made it possible for people to download bits of the film in progress, remix them, and send them back to us as we were making it. And this was before social media like YouTube and Facebook made this very easy. And this is sort of now part of our cultural vernacular. It's basically what TikTok is. But we wanted to sort of incorporate that into the making of a film at the time. I was going to show a quick clip from this to see what that looked like, but I realized I forgot to click that share sound button. So let's see how this goes. Started a website. Can you see? Can you hear that?
I can hear that.
All my footage on. Yes. To see what
Yes.
people do with it. Okay. So far, this film has been mixed and remixed to the point where 64 university students even got together to make an animated version. So now I've got a posse, and we're creating this movie together. Whenever you see this sign, you'll know that this piece of video came from someone else. Maybe it came from you.
These are communities. They're being created by the opportunity this technology makes available. And these communities engage in a kind of conversation, each one taking what the other had done and adding to it, mixing it and changing it, and engaging in a creative act.
Yeah. Hello.
And my community taught me that the remix game has been going on for a long time.
Yeah. When you experiment with cut-ups over a period of time, you find that some of the cut-ups and rearranged text seem to refer to future events. Done at random, cutting and break.
I'm going to pause it there. You kind of get the idea of the way that other people were contributing to the aesthetic of the film. And we were able to kind of try to walk the walk a little bit about what the film was celebrating and incorporating that phenomena into the way that the film was made, and that the audience would be able to sort of understand remix culture in a much more visceral way because they were able to participate in it themselves, or to be able to witness what this phenomena of remix culture looks like in a way that was more embedded than if somebody were just to tell them. And so this idea of bringing forth the phenomena is also something that motivated Do Not Track, which was a 2015 multi-platform documentary series that kind of explored the next phase of the internet's evolution, which is the sort of more surveillance capitalism mode. In this series, multiple different directors, including Sandra Rodriguez, who was on this series, took up different ways of exploring aspects of the internet's evolution. And through all of them, what we were attempting to do was to show the user how information was collected about them and then integrating that data into the story. So I can show you a little bit about what the first episode of that looked like here. So remember, this is a web page. It's not a movie.
Mm-hmm.
We've all got our addictions. We've all got our routine. Mine is to wake up, get caffeine, go online. A little bit on a desktop, a bit on the phone. Over the morning, I give away gigabytes of information about myself, and I give it without being asked. This is my name. This is where I live. This is me on Twitter. These are my photos. All of this I share out of habit. I guess it's also part of the routine. Some would even call it addiction. But there's a lot that I share without knowing it, and so do you. For instance, I know right now that this is the country you live in. I know that it's a shitty morning.
I know that you're on a Mac. These are things I know just from where you're accessing this website before the day even gets started. So let's start the day. Part of my everyday routine is to see what the world is doing. Tell me where you go to get your news.
So here, a user would kind of input their own website that they go to every day, and then the system that we built visits that website in the
The
background.
blue dot that you're seeing represents the site you are visiting right now. The red dots represent third parties who are notified each time you visit that site. Some of these third parties are called.
And so then we would go on to sort of explain how that system worked, and we would sort of store that knowledge that we're gaining about the user into an application programming interface or an API that began to build a profile of that user as the series progressed. And don't worry, we made all of that very transparent to the user and sort of opted in. Who opted in, and by doing that, we were trying to transparently show how every single website that a user was visiting around that time of 2014, 2015 was doing this practice. And then other creators could then use that information in different ways. So for example, the episode that Sandra made, that was an episode that related to big data and the inferences that could be made about a user's activity. And so she was much more interested in the sort of time users took to make a decision, or what types of imagery that they were gravitating towards. And then she would, branch her story based on that. But then that was also being added to this profile of a person. And I think that those sort of methods and that sort of reality about the modern internet has been the dominant way that many nonfiction makers have presented the internet since around that time. And as a result, I think that the way that we're communicating about the current state of the internet and digital culture has become quite dour and depressing and scary. These are just some screenshots of different films that you can find on Netflix or, local or any other kind of streamer. And, AI has obviously exacerbated this problem quite a bit. This is the Trump Gaza video that many of you may have seen, that somebody attempted to do a parody of Trump's plan to I don't know what the heck he was saying that he was going to do, but he was going to turn Gaza into sort of the Mayan Riviera kind of thing, and then was retweeted an AI video that a satirist had made, just sort of contributing to this information apocalypse that AI has sort of created. And in the time since, I think that audiences are growing weary of this nonstop dumpster fire of news about the internet. And I needed to kind of reflect in my practice whether I was contributing to this denial of life and joy that Emma was discussing when she was dancing. Or was I being part of this narrative that the internet is ruined, that all is lost? And so around the time of the pandemic, I wanted to sort of reinvigorate my practice and began a PhD at Simon Fraser University, where I really wanted to look at how I could reinvigorate a sense of play into my practice, and how the works could somehow find a way to be simultaneously joyful while also recognizing aspects of this culture that were troubling to me. And so that ambivalence that I spoke of earlier has been something that I've been trying to find in these three projects that I wanted to talk about, which are Welcome to the Metaverse, The Education of Ursula, and Brain Rot Revolution. And so when we talk about play, I think we all kind of like know it when we see it,
Mhm.
But I thought it's interesting to think about it also in more of a scholarly sense. What do we mean when we say play? Well, scholars have identified 4 different sort of types of play, which are agon, competition and mastery, which is what you're doing when you play Fortnite, mimicry, role playing, and imagination, which is often fun for us to think about as storytellers because it points to the fact that you can have play not just in games, right? But when you're putting people in that mindset that asks them to imagine otherwise. Aliyah is play that involves risk and chance, like a game show, and Elinix is the play that comes from physical thrills and sensory disorientation. So if any of you have ever played Portal, which is me and my son's favorite game, you kind of know what we're talking about here. Okay, and I also wanted to kind of marshal this idea of ethical spectacle, which refers to the fact that, you know, progressive politics often places a priority on the real and the sense that it is our duty to challenge to question anything that is false, and that you see this a lot in the documentary community. Whereas on the right, more reactionary oriented individuals don't feel this same pressure. And so you could have a Trump Gaza video online where they're not concerned about whether this is true or not, or represents an objective reality, but they are quite aware of its potential, its political potential. And so how can progressive individuals find ways to create this sort of spectacle, to create this imaginary, to create this play while still staying within ethical boundaries? And so the first project I embarked on, this sort of research creation set of experiments, is Welcome to the Metaverse. So what this project is a face filter, which many of you have used on Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat. But instead of just sort of like putting dog ears on the viewer, we asked, what if you could tell a documentary story using those face filters? And what if that documentary story was sort of culture jamming the very sort of platform that it was on? So in our case, Instagram. And this was the time that Facebook as a company transitioned to Meta, because they wanted to create the metaverse. And so, so we told this story of their ambitions through sort of a speculative lens. And what you'll see on the right is the result. And then we published a paper on our findings afterwards. So again, hopefully the sound is working. And Adjoa, just yell at me if it's not, because I can't see you.
Will do.
So this is my PhD supervisor, Kate.
Blink if you agree to the
The sound
terms
is
and
working.
conditions. We are so excited you've agreed to join the metaverse. Tap your face to discover our cutting-edge algorithms. To create the metaverse, we first collected millions of photos of our users on the vintage website known as Facebook. We used these faces to create an algorithm that can detect your face. Once your face is data, think of what we can do together. Select all the likes to enter the metaverse. Thanks to the pioneering work on the Facebook timeline in 2004, data scientists now understand content that generates strong emotions keeps you engaged longer. This will come in handy in the metaverse. Tap the screen to measure your outrage. Are you angry yet? Well, here is how much money Mark Zuckerberg made while you were watching this. Show us if that makes you angry. Show us that you're happy, and we'll move on to the next chapter.
All right, she did it. So the way that we made this face filter was using Meta's own platform called Spark. And so this it's basically an authoring environment where the features of your face become the interface essentially for the interactive work. And so here you can see that their logic sort of like creates a node for the when a user blinks. And so here we're trying to bring forth the very phenomena we seek to explore by sort of making it very transparent to users that somebody is tracking your face, right? And they're building a business model based on your face with this work. And so rather than culture jamming, we kind of named this practice context jamming, because the challenge with a work like this is that in contrast to a billboard where everybody sees the same billboard, and so if I deface Coca-Cola, everybody can see this has the same context for that. Online, you know, Ajwa, your feed and my feed are going to be completely different based on our preferences. And so the context in which this filter arrives will be different for you than it will be for me. And also your face is different than my face. And so how do we make work that sort of understands that that personalization and also make that the subject of what we want to discuss? So that was what we were trying to get after in that work. And it was interesting that we also had to publish it on the platform that we were criticizing. And our first attempt at publishing it was unsuccessful. It was rejected, but it wasn't rejected because we were making fun of Mark Zuckerberg. It was rejected because we used this Facebook thumbs up icon, which the color blue in that icon is trademarked by Meta. And so they rejected it and we fixed it, and then it was able to be published. But now Meta has actually discontinued the entire Spark platform and everything that was ever published on it. So it showed us that these kind of interventions are very ephemeral and sort of need to be done on the spot. So the second work is the education of Ursula, which was part of the so it was inspired by a podcast series called Necessary Tomorrows, which I created with the Doha debates and published on Al Jazeera. And this was a 6-part speculative fiction documentary hybrid. And the narrator of this series diegetically was named Ursula. And so Ursula was this sort of, was an AI from the year 2065 who had been picking up on the fact that you had anxiety about the future. Oh, there's a question in the chat.
I will get to the questions at the
Okay.
end. Yes.
All right. So yeah, and so basically it's a six-part podcast series. We had tons of world building and data. And the question that we asked there was whether we could actually kind of like, hey, we have this narrator. Can we actually see if we could have an audience could have a conversation with her? And the sort of research question around this had to do with futures literacy. That was the sort of idea of the whole Necessary Tomorrows series, was how do we build people's capacity for imagining different possible futures than the one that we were in. So this project came out was incubated in 2020, 2021. If you can cast your mind back to what you were thinking at that time, you were probably thinking a lot about what the future was going to be like. And so this picture here of the futures cone was also very inspiring to me. What this diagram shows is basically like, as you can see on the very far right, it includes everything in the future that is possible. There's nothing outside of this cone. Not everything outside of this cone is impossible. It can't happen. Do they defy the laws of physics, or just can't happen? And so the other axis is time. So from now until time. And then if you kind of narrow in on that cone, you get to the plausible, what's likely to happen, or what, one in is what is probable, what we think is going to happen. But there's another cone there, which is the preferable, what we wish would happen, the futures that we think are the most beneficial for the most people, that circle that those of us who are always trying to think about how to make the world a better place are trying to orient ourselves and to sort of build the capacity for people for imagining those, because oftentimes we're only thinking about that probable future, right? And that's not always the preferable one. And so there's this game called The Thing from the Future that a futurist named Stuart Candy created to sort of to help people generate these possibilities. Basically, it's like a Cards Against Humanity, if you ever played that, but for futures. So during the card game, you imagine a thing from a future related to something, and you sort of create this phrase. So you might create in a scary future, there is a banana related to I don't have the cards in front of me. In a scary future, there is a banana related to literacy, right? And then that forces the people around the table to sort of describe that future. And I'd actually done this with students. I'm a sessional lecturer occasionally at the University of Victoria, and we did this with generative AI. So we actually had the students kind of play this game, imagine these futures, and then create the object from that future, and then talk about it, like what's going on in that future. And I found it a super fun pedagogical exercise, super fun, way to engage young people and use generative AI in a different way. And so we thought, well, what if Ursula could actually host this game? And so on the left, that is the actor, Nasia Walsh, who played Ursula in the podcast series. And she is also a real science fiction nerd. And she basically, with her son, she scanned her face, and then we used the Unreal Engine to then instantiate a metahuman version of Ursula. We fed this character all of the world building that we had created in this series, and then created a system where that character interacted with a different set of AI tools. So on the top, you see OpenAI, which was the tool that we used to process the logic. 11 Labs, which is the tool that we use to create a voice synthesis clone of Nasia that then Ursula would be able to speak through. And then we created our own logic and sort of a narrative tool for me to sort of script the way that she would interact with the audience. And then we presented this at a new media festival called Signals in Vancouver, which is part of the Vancouver International Film Festival. So this is a little video about what that looked like.
HoloLabs built Ursula to prototype an immersive storytelling experience using generative AI and game engines.
Welcome, I am Ursula. I am a co-intelligence program to help you envision possible futures.
When you first meet Ursula, she gets to know you by striking up a conversation.
Can you tell me where you are from?
I am from Iran.
I'm from North Sweden.
Now, what is your name?
David.
Nice to meet you, David. It must be peculiar to engage with an AI that communicates like a human, but is decidedly not one.
From this data, she generates a unique image that represents how she sees you.
The person in the image is wearing a patterned top, which suggests a casual style, perhaps signaling a relaxed and approachable personality. Her long, curly hair frames her face, which might indicate a preference for natural beauty.
She then reflects, based on what she sees, on how you might be feeling about the future.
Your slight smile might indicate a sense of contentment or curiosity about engaging with technology. This positive demeanor can be refreshing in times of uncertainty.
Players choose from a series of cards which combine to describe an object in the future. Ursula then generates an image of that object, and players must then describe the future in which this object exists.
In the version of the future I am imagining, climate change will have been solved and masks will be a relic from the past.
There is a group of people who carry on the knowledge of the past,
which Ursula then processes and rates according to whether it is utopian or dystopian, probable or unlikely.
So you can see with that work how, Ursula basically plays that card game with them, then generates that actual image from the future that the story would dictate, and then sort of has a conversation with the audience member about that future. What that video doesn't really point out is that in the dialogue, Ursula sort of expresses the fact that the way that she expresses basically the ambivalence that we described about AI is embedded into the way that she discusses with the player. So for instance, if she might make an observation about a player's emotion, she's very clear to point out that she can't actually know a person's emotion based on their facial expression, which points to this idea of trying to refute sort of the enchanted determinism that we ascribe to AI, because AI can't actually know how you're feeling based on how you look. Nobody can, nor can they know things like your gender by the way that you look. And so having that sort of self-deprecating doubt about the affordances of AI was kind of a key part of what we were doing with that work, and also the way that the images were generated. So we thought that there would be an interesting opportunity to kind of summon that phenomenon by having Ursula observe you, have some characteristics, and then generate an image based on what she observed, and then have a dialogue with you about the way that those two things diverge. All right, almost done. So Brain Rot Revolution is something that we came up with in March. This is a really weird slide. It represents Shoggoth, who is a character from H.P. Lovecraft's fiction, which has come to represent, for many in Silicon Valley, the current state of the large language model. So Shoggoth is, if you're familiar with H.P. Lovecraft, he was a terrible person who imagined these kind of monsters, and one of them was Shoggoth, who was frightening because of its essential unknowability, its otherness. He was a racist, and he anyway, that's a different talk. But for whatever reason, well, I'll tell you the reason that it has become this mascot of those that are creating many of these large language models is because for them, the AI is this unknowable creature. They don't always completely understand how and why it is generating the language that it does, but to present something that is acceptable and understandable to humans on top of this basic logic of the model, they run something called supervised fine-tuning, which is when you sort of direct the large language model, no, not this, yes, this. And this process of supervised fine-tuning is that sort of like little human face that's on the front of Shoggoth, and then the reinforcement learning from human feedback is when you take that a step further and show it to people and have them rate the responses of the AI. That's the part that we get to see in ChatGPT, but underneath it is this sort of like unknowable monster. I hope I did some justice to that. But the other image that sort of inspired me to create Brain Rot Revolution was this image of Shrimp Jesus, which is sort of refers to this dead internet theory that is going around that proposes that almost all of the content that or the increasing amount of content that we see online is in fact AI generated slop, which is easy for us to sort of like dismiss and act, and as artists, but in fact many people cannot distinguish between. So Stanford ran a study where they showed images like this, which are often they're basically like clickbait, where bots have figured out the type of imagery that is the most likely to generate engagement online. So like on the top left, fantastic wood carving. This lady deserves a recognition. Like that's not a real lady and that's not a real drawing. And for whatever reason, Shrimp Jesus is the one that has generated the most engagement because it's like super bizarre and engaging. And people are like, wait a minute, that's how did they get shrimps on Jesus? And then other people are saying that's not a real image on Jesus. And then the bots are noticing this engagement and generating more imagery like this and creating this kind of like recursive feedback loop of bullshit is the academic term. And this sort of like recursive nature where a model is picking up on negative qualities of an engagement loop and then replicating them also refers to another phenomenon that we're noticing in AI, which is called model collapse. Because the models need to continue to grow to attract investment, they need to ingest more data. But because they've almost ingested all of the data that was available online prior to the emergence of these models, the companies like OpenAI are starting to create models whose sole purpose is to generate synthetic content that will allow them to have content to continue to grow, right? So it's like they're starting to be trained on synthetic data. But what happens when they continue to train this way is that the resulting images turn into garbage. And so I wanted to try to play with this phenomenon, summon this phenomenon with a game that players might play called Brain Rot Revolution. So over a game jam in March, in 2 weeks, we made a prototype of an experience where you train Shoggoth using memes from the internet and you play a bubble shooter game with your body. And this is what that looks like, and then I'll be done. So here we go. So these are the memes that Shoggoth ingests. And then you play it by matching 3 memes that causes Shoggoth to train himself and go to the sort of next level in his growth. And if you are able to train enough of them, then he blows up and you have destroyed the internet essentially. And the question is asked to the audience, well, what would you build next? And so with Brain Rot, we're trying to bring forth the very phenomenon we seek to explore, which is how would we playfully give people the experience of destroying the internet that we've come to doubt, but also to ask them the question, maybe for the first time, what is the internet that you want? What is the internet that we deserve? What is the internet? How could we do things differently? And I think that for most people, they sort of think about the internet almost like they don't think about the internet. It's like electricity or roads, things that you take for granted as basic infrastructure. And this asking them this question, maybe it's could be the first time that they've encountered that as a notion. What is the internet, and how would I like it to work differently? And so having a game like this is sort of like for the first time maybe puts you in that position where you're asking that question, and then a next phase of Brain Rot Revolution might be an opportunity to lead them through a speculative process of imagining a different internet. So with these 3 works, they're working at different registers of this idea of play. So like Ursula, has actually a bit of it where you're competing to sort of imagine the best future. That we can get into that in the Q&A about whether that was successful, but certainly Brainrot is like a competitive game. You're competing against your friend to blow up Shoggoth. And all three of them work on this idea of mimicry, of role playing and imagination. Ursula does have this element of risk and chance, but that's why it works as a speculative exercise, because you literally have to play the cards that you're dealt to imagine that future, instead of being asked, like, what future do you think is more likely to happen? And then Welcome to the Metaverse definitely has this idea of sort of sensory disorientation when a different face is presented on your own face. So these are all kind of ways that I've been hoping to kind of play with AI in a different way than the sort of like only pointing out to the audiences the degree to which we're in this sort of doom loop, trying to marshal play to put them in a different perspective and maybe ask them this question of what internet would you like? How could AI help to create the future that you want? So that's that. As well.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Brett. Thank you so much. I actually really understand this point of view. I've heard before where people speak about how, the future is play, and I think I really understood it at a very like simplistic point of view was that like, well, maybe when AI takes out over all the tasks, that's all we'll have left. But I've never thought of this, concept that you've just taken us through of like play as culture jamming, play as increasing literacy, particularly AI literacy, play as building the future. And I've really appreciated how you've taken us through that because I think what we seek to do in this convening and also in this series is just remove the intimidation that
Yeah.
people, I think, across the world, and I know particularly as artists, which is the community that we are speaking directly to, but remove that intimidation when it comes to AI so that we can confront it, we can make it, we can redefine whatever it is the use case is it, and in that way sort of input into the framework. So I know that this is a presentation I'm going to look back and like try, watch it again because I think you've really seeded something about the fact that and I hear this tension with the ambivalence because I think a lot of people, I would always call it like being arrested, like when it comes to AI, where you just
Hmm.
don't know, so you just don't use it. And you think if you don't use it, I don't know what you hope is going to happen, but it's in the confronting, it's in the playing,
Yeah.
and I guess that's why like our communities, which is like immersive gaming communities, have I guess so much less of the fear because they are playing, and therefore almost like with Ursula, like humanizing this AI, like just stripping it of its fangs in kinds of ways. So I've really appreciated this perspective. And from there, I think let's have a very short conversation and then we can get to the questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I will kick off back to because we are tying it with the previous work from Electric South. Um, and I know that the toolkit was a long time ago, and it was really a conversation starter. And like I say, what we do is try to make this less intimidating. But do you think that there's anything from the approaches or what was set down in 2023 that still stands out as relevant today?
I mean, yeah, I think that there were big questions, like as we spoke about in the introduction about, holding holding these companies to account about the extractive nature of the models. But I think for me, what has changed is, well, they are very accessible to us as artists. So that's the if you are building an interactive work, like for us to build Ursula, and now granted, I made that in collaboration with a technical team that I work with in my my professional life. And so saying that they're like broadly available, it's like, yeah, they're broadly available if you if you already have the means to make an Unreal project. But still, um, that is quite a step from where they might have been when those that toolkit was created. So it's broadly available. Um, and so now we're in a different position of not just sort of critiquing them abstractly, but we can kind of get our hands dirtier in the work, right? And for me, that means that we have to sort of do this thing of resting in some of those contradictions and making work from with that as the sort of baseline, um, as opposed to only finding ways to sort of like poke holes in it. I think we still need to do that, but doing it from a perspective of like, I am using this, and how do I hold those tensions and make work that's sort of honest and reflexive um, about what I'm seeing as I use it. And I'm only speaking for myself. I think refusal of these tools is a very that's some people's position, and I respect it. But for me, with that idea of sort of culture jamming or wanting to sort of summon the phenomenon, I do need to do this other thing. And so um, the great thinker Donna Haraway sort of refers to this as staying with the trouble of kind of like knowing that we're in this moment where these forces and these tools are present, and how which parts of these do we want to incorporate into our practice or into our communities, and which do we reject, and where are the places that an intervention is necessary, etc. And for me, sort of like trying to understand how they work, and also being reflexive about where it doesn't work, and where like actually that's a thing that I don't think is possible. For instance, with Ursula, this sort of we went through a lot of debate related to anthropomorphizing AI just in general, and places where that's actually quite problematic, right? If you anthropomorphize them, you are sort of ascribing to them a lot of the agency that they don't actually have, right? And so we're orientating the players position towards AI as if they are speaking to a human, and they're not. And so the places where we do that, are we then granting power to that, are we actually doing OpenAI's work for them, and then also sort of like missing opportunities to be more critical about the work. And so we were very present with that, and so we attempted to have Ursula sort of like be reflexive herself, and with mixed success. I'm not sure that I would do a project like that in general, or sorry again. But I needed to learn, for me, what how audiences would react to that, how I would feel about it, how I would feel about the work. So being willing to play and sort of like make mistakes, and put them in front of audiences too, I think is something that's important to me, even because we don't know the way to work with these. We're all sort of like, each time you try to do something, you're making, you might be the only one doing it in this way. And so sharing the results and having community, I think is like a pretty big key. But we're just in a different moment than we were a few years ago, because of that accessibility, and because there's sort of more works. There's like, I can, as I go around to different festivals, I've seen other works that are similar to Ursula, but with different sort of like, other people who didn't try to anthropomorphize, and what that was like, and different works where the narrative could branch more, they have a more open conversation, or things like that. And so that's also a different perspective than we would have been in when we were just like wondering like, ooh, what will people do with these? Okay, now people have done a few things with these, let's reflect.
I think that from what you're saying, and also, yeah, just from hearing it back, it seems like this is the only way, then maybe not the only way, but a significant way to find empowerment in this AI I don't know what to call it, revolution moment that we're currently in,
Mhm.
this seems like one of the ways to sort of get through. So I understand why you say like, oh, I wouldn't do Ursula now, but it was necessarily to do Ursula to get to this point
Yeah.
where you can now do other stuff as well. And
I
I
mean, it's
think,
pardon me, go ahead.
sorry, and I was going to link that actually to Nhlanhla's question on the chat, which is how do ideas in RIP, a remix manifesto, translate to today's AI-driven remix culture, especially around artists' rights and cultural ownership?
Yeah, yes, thank you for this question. I mean, I think about this a lot, because you know, without having to uh, give you the whole plot of that film, it had this manifesto where sort of culture builds on the past, and that there's these impediments to the future that are being held up by these sort of greedy companies that won't like allow the works to be put into the public domain.
Mm.
That was true. And if you follow that to its logical conclusion, like all of us should just give all of our works to OpenAI, and I think that that's um, not what we were saying in RIP. Was that we actually needed ways for artists to be more empowered, to be able to say like, here are the works, here are the uses that I'm open to my work being used for. And I actually had a very visceral experience of this, which I documented in the work Discriminator, where my own photos, which I had released under Creative Commons licenses, had pictures of my face, and those were used to train a facial recognition model, as along with 5 million other people's faces. And I would not have consented to that because those are now being used for all kinds of uses that I would not consent to. Um, but at the time, the thing that I was, the context, right, that those, I imagined those photos being used was in sort of like artistic works or sort of like pastiche and collage. I'd never imagined that they would be used to train an artificial intelligence model. And so I think to this person's question, I think we need to sort of support. And I know that actually this was coming up in some of the workshops that you all have hosted as well. Like, you know, folks in the continent, how are they thinking about archival archiving and the rights that they want their works to carry,
Mm.
what uses they do not want them to be used for. How do we build in structures where these large language these models respect those sort of cultural directives? I think that that's a huge part of it. I don't know that always the technical solutions are going to solve all of those use cases, but I think we really need to think about consent in this new context and
Mm.
what that looks like.
Full consent.
Yes, yeah, more consent, which I think is a moving target, right? And it's
Mm.
something that you kind of like just we as makers have to be reflexive for our, so like for instance with Ursula, Nasia was a big part of the creation of that project, and we had very strict sort of like, okay, like I understand that Ursula is going to be present in this context of this film festival, but no, you can't show it anywhere else because I don't understand the context that it's being used, and no one else may use this model of my voice or my likeness or whatever. And we were very like strict about that and sort of like open with her as an actor but also as a human, right? It's her likeness, and so like one
Mm.
can imagine the scenario where she's that likeness is saying things that she would not approve of. And so I think just sort of staying with the trouble and kind of being present to the moment that you're in and trying to think about it and be in conversation. And these are ethics that the documentary community is actually well positioned to work through, because they're very similar to the concerns that you have to have when you're going into a community that you are not necessarily from, or you have a certain responsibility when you're making a film to any other human that whose story you're trying to that you have the responsibility to safeguard and to present to the world properly. So I think they're similar in that way.
That is very true. Another question from Nhlanhla. He says, William Burroughs' cut-up method disrupted linear narrative to open new ways of seeing. How might AI and immersive technologies extend this practice of fragmentation and recombination for artists?
That's an awesome question. Yeah, great question. I mean, I think that like what I was exploring in brain rot, where you have um, this weird feedback loop where the AI is getting these signals, right? That oh, like shrimp Jesus, and
Mm,
I should probably pick another image, but like an image that is gaining attention because of its perversity. We don't have a way of we need to instruct these models that that's the reason it's getting attention is because of its perversity, not necessarily because it's like
mm,
the truest, right? Which is sort of the model that Google has operated under for a long time. That we've been like, oh, so many people are clicking on this link to Electric South because that's the right one that you should go to based on these two, nouns. But like, what if there's some other Electric South, it's like a buzzing compass or something like that, and that sort of like steals all the attention. So I don't think that's actually what the question that the person was asking, but I think it does point to the attention is a very present factor in how these models are constructed. In fact, like the transformer model in that's the T in GPT is based on attention. Like where is when we the chicken crosses the road is the thing, the road is the right token to present in the sentence because that's what we've noticed people have the most attention on. And I think that
mm,
that focus is going to change in much the same way as montage changed the way that you could make meaning by like rearranging different ideas. I think this sort of like algorithmic reliance on attention is also going to do it. And I don't know. I think the person who asked this question needs to play with it themselves. You know what I mean? And find a way to get their hands dirty with one of those models and see what it can do.
Yeah, I'm hearing that
It's
it's almost I don't want to say terrifying, but it's almost scary to think that how when people don't have how when so many people don't know how to play with this technology in this way that you do, how do we get to real literacy, real AI, like substantial AI literacy, without that? And I remember that when I spoke to Ingrid about the fact that I was going to speak to you, she said, "Well, yeah, that's why you have to speak to Brett because." It's almost like, yeah, without this in-depth interacting with the technology in this way, you just cannot get to any form of literacy, and that's not where the widespread teaching is, you know. Um,
yeah, and I think that that's part of what us as a community needs to figure out, or what are the ways that we can democratize
mm,
um, the forms so that it's actually wasn't that hard to create something like Ursula or um, Ursula was actually pretty hard, but um, to get the first glimpse of it wasn't actually very hard. It was making it presentable and making it sort of like reliable that was hard. Um, and so like are there ways that we can create templates or workshops or things where
mm,
we've kind of created like that card game from the future is actually a really you know th- this is a game that you can have and you can play and you can play it at a convening. A lot of thought went into this, right? So that it was available for other
mm,
people around a table that weren't themselves futurists. They were like urban planners or you know organic gardeners or whatever had access to that. And so like democratizing those forms,
mm,
that takes a lot of work, but then the downstream impact of that is actually can be quite transformational. So like how do we do that? And so like, Ingrid's somebody that's done that in many different contexts. So like, how do we do that for, when people were thinking about the web, you know,
Mm.
how do we create funding models that will allow more people access to um, formats that they can easily sort of work on top of, and then all of those things sort of like start to look the same. So then we need to make an intervention lower down the stack so that it's, okay, well,
Mm.
maybe we need to bring in more designers or technologists or writers or thinkers, and like identifying where those points are that people can kind of democratize the models a bit. And not, I don't mean the LLM models, I mean the like models of production, the sort of like, okay,
Yes.
this is emerging as a way you can communicate about this. This is like, the yeah, and we did that with the Brain Rot Revolution game, for example. So the company that I'm working with, we were wanting to play with, okay, how do you control a game with your body, right? And so like I have this weird future thing that I want to play with, but someone else she wanted to make a game where that was about a family photo that she had, and the people that were playing sort of move their arms to reveal what was underneath, right? It's a totally different motivation for her, but she was able to use the same toolkit, and we open sourced that for everybody, right? And so, you could imagine a hack day where you're trying to like figure out those formats and then like release them to more people and things like that. Those can be very powerful interventions.
Mm. I'm going to go to another question in the chat, which is how can artists uphold Le Cirque's remix culture principles when AI generates work from existing content?
Which remix principles?
Le Cirque's remix culture principles.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure I'm getting that particular reference, but I think that um, I think okay, so I think that there's one remix principle is like cite your sources. How do
Mm.
you give credit where credit is due? And often that's actually being there's this sort of humility that one needs to practice as a sort of collage artist, that you might actually not know that like, oh, this thing that you sampled that you thought was someone else's idea actually refers more to this original idea. um, and and to be able to sort of cite that chain, I think, is really important. And AI models are messing with that quite a bit, right? There was a step that OpenAI did not go through, of getting consent from every
Mm.
artist that's in those models, and that's why they're being sued all over the place. And they're relying on a very American legal doctrine known as fair use, which is the
Yes.
same legal doctrine that we relied on to create RIP, a Remix Manifesto, right? But the thing is, when we were making that film, we actually had to go through a pretty extensive legal process where we said, okay, here are the credits of the film are super long because we cite all of our sources, but we also had to go through and say like, um, are you passing this test, which is, are you using, like, how much of the work are you using? Are you making your own original point? Could you make this point using a different set of media? We ran it through that test, and yes, boom, it's legal and ethical. They didn't do that, right? And so a lot of that stuff will
Mm.
be sort of tested in the courts. Um, and so I don't think that's a very satisfying answer to this question, which is a really good question. But it depends on like which. So for me, there's ethical principles there around citing your sources, doing your due diligence about that, and that's important. Um, and then there's like, yeah, in terms of like that ambivalence, sometimes I do want to actually create an image that is, by its nature, it is showing that there have been many. Okay, so as an example, in the Necessary Tomorrows project, there's also a film, and we wanted to create an image we wanted to demonstrate that most people's images of the future, or many images of the future in science fiction, are dystopian. And so we would sort of like type in a prompt that was like, you know, show me a future, and then it would be like Mad Max or Terminator, and that demonstrates that in popular culture there's a bias towards this type of imagery, right? And so,
Mm,
and it's a useful tool to demonstrate that point. And in that case, you know, how would I properly credit Mad Max and the Terminator and 20 days, 8 days later, etc. Um, it's just a really complicated question, and so um, you try to sort of like say like perhaps in this image we're seeing this type of robot with a gun because of this movie, The Terminator, or even further back in Metropolis, etc. So you try to have a reflexivity about the work that sort of helps people understand how that image was made, and sort of like all of the biases that might have gone into it, and try to surface those rather than just sort of presenting them alongside of another image that wasn't made by AI, right? That was made by a human, that like
mm,
be transparent about how those images were made, and then help them think through things that they might not have thought about
mm.
what had to happen for that image to be made.
It's almost like we need to bake in radical honesty into
Yeah.
our intellectual property. And I think that you actually hit, like, so I did look up Lissa's principles, and it really is about how, copyright laws are really outdated now, and we do need to just embrace and, I guess, create regulation for remix culture. And I think that what you're saying is right on the nose. Yeah. So I have one more question, because we are at time. And I think that this is then to just like leave our audience with the last nugget from our guest, Brett Gaylor. And my last question would be then, if you were to give one practical piece of advice to an African artist experimenting with AI for the first time, what would that be? Or playing with AI, if I'm to
Mm.
use your terminology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, Ajwa, you mentioned it earlier too, is to it's to stay with the trouble, right? It's to sort of
Mm,
like you might have an apprehension about using these tools because you might find yourself implicated in a sort of a software stack or a political stack that you do not endorse.
mm,
And so, um, what are ways that you can sort of foreground your concerns and your reflexivity in the work that you make? Um, and um, what is the sort of minimum viable exploration that you can make about that? So, um, oftentimes you might see on, gosh, we don't use Twitter anymore, do we? But on whatever social network that you might have gone by, you would find places that um, people had experimented with these tools that revealed ways in which they were biased, or that their construction sort of like gave hints at sort of maybe some of the problematic power structures underneath them. Um, the great American academic Ruha Benjamin encourages us to sort of like pay attention to those glitches. The glitch is actually a place uh, that some of these structures can show up. So, for example, she tells a story about trying to navigate. Um, uh, I believe it was in Washington D.C. So she was using Siri to sort of navigate to a location, and it said, "Oh, take Martin 10 Boulevard," and she's like, What is this thing trying to say? Take Martin 10 Boulevard," and she's like, "Oh no, sorry, Malcolm 10 Boulevard." She's like, oh, it's talking about Malcolm X. And she was like, okay, clearly there was no black engineer on this project, or there's no way that it would be presenting itself as Malcolm 10 Boulevard. And so pay attention to those places, because then that glitch might be a place that you can sort of dig deeper and investigate. And to sort of like find those tensions, you don't need to create something as in-depth and resource intensive as a thing like Ursula. You might actually be able to do that just within a chat GPT conversation, but then you might then be able to sort of peel the onion a little bit further. Like, okay, what if I can take that, the API of that, and do I have a friend that's a developer that can then make me a different web page that, so as another example, at the Copenhagen Documentary Festival, they have a similar program to Electric South, the CPH Lab, that I would encourage everybody on this call, if they have a nonfiction project, to consider. I mentored a maker who had wanted to explore like the ways in which the AI was and was not a useful tool in therapy. And so with a very simple interface, they had sort of replicated ChatGPT, but your job was to act as the psychologist to the large language model. And what that demonstrated to them was the way that at the end of the day, the model just basically always was going to tell them what they wanted to hear, right? And that was the sort of thing, the phenomenon they wanted to summon. And that project was not complicated at all, and they found the glitch just with conversations with ChatGPT. But then they wanted to sort of be able to create a narrative around it and a sort of like affectation to the voice that they wouldn't have been able to do with ChatGPT. So with a little bit of collaboration, they were able to create something that was more meaningful and sort of artistically realized. But the glitch they found first. So okay, I'm gonna rephrase that as one as one piece of advice. It's like, find the glitch and then find ways that you can kind of like make a artistic work around it.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. And special thanks to you, Brett Gaylor, for sharing such generous insights into your projects and into how artists can find the glitch, can play with the technology, and like we say, be less intimidated, so, overcome that ambivalence that you spoke to. Thank you so much for sharing your critique, your imagination. To everyone, that concludes our three-part Electric Africa webinar series for 2025 ahead of the convening in Johannesburg. If you've missed the previous sessions, they will be on our YouTube channel. I'm Ajwa Nkoma. It's been a pleasure to host you. Thank you again, Brett. And hopefully we will see you in another iteration.